Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining our webinar today about BFRDP and Adult Education theory and how that is applicable to the Beginning Farmer and Rancher Development Program, USDA Competitive Grants Program. So today we'll have Christof Bernau giving us information about adult education theory and how it applies to the BFRDP grant program. And Christof is the Apprenticeship Instructor and Farm Garden Manager at University of California, Santa Cruz Center for Agroecology and Sustainable Food Systems. First, I'm going to start with just a quick overview of the technology for the WebEx program that we're using today. As you can see in this slide, the audio controls are up in the upper left-hand corner of your menu bar. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties in terms of hearing the audio, feel free to choose those settings to change your audio connection. And if you have questions throughout the webinar, feel free to chat them in the chat box. And you can select if you'd like to send the question to all participants, which is perfectly fine for all to see, or if you want to send just to the presenter, you have that option as well in the drop-down. So for a quick look at the agenda, I'm going to go through a very brief overview of new entry and who we are. Christof, again, will take the content of adult education, getting into methods and pedagogy, and we'll have time at the end for Q&A. And following the webinar, you'll receive an email with a link to a survey to evaluate the webinar today, in addition to the recorded webinar and the presentation slides, plus links to other resources relevant to the BFRDP grant program. So just for a little bit of information about new entry, we've been working here in Massachusetts since 1998 as a program of Tufts University. We have on-the-ground work in the local area here with farmer training and food access initiatives. And I myself, Kristen Aldrich, I work on the national team as a National Technical Assistance Manager, providing support to food systems organizations across the country, which comes in the form of webinars like these, as well as developing resources and other ways that we can help support folks. This particular grant project is an Education Enhancement Team grant that we received from USDA to support applicants of the BFRDP program. So through that project, we've been able to develop some resources, including an online self-assessment tool to help potential applicants walk through the different considerations and factors if they're interested in applying. We conduct different webinars and have other resources available on our website. And I will point out, as many of you may know, the RFA for fiscal year 2018 for the BFRDP program is now out, and it is due on February 8th in 2018. So as I said, we have the wonderful opportunity to work with some excellent partners and other colleagues and organizations around the country who can offer some specific expertise in different areas that might be useful for folks who are applying for BFRDP. And we are so pleased and honored to have Christof here today to talk about education, adult education theory, and how that can help you with your potential project that you might propose for BFRDP. So with that, I'll pass the presenter ball along to Christof to take it away from here.
Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. I guess I'm on the West Coast, so I am, it's still late morning for us here. I am working, you should now see, hopefully on your screen, the beginnings of a webinar, and I'm going to go right ahead and start if that's out there and clear to everybody. Welcome, and thank you very much for joining us today. I am going to spend the bulk of the next hour talking a little bit about the theory around adult education, and then really how we apply that in our programming here at University of California, Santa Cruz. And we do a variety of programming, both with undergraduates, the wider public of the Monterey Bay area, as well as a 6-month intensive program that we call the Apprenticeship in All Aspects of Small-Scale Organic Farming. So we'll talk a little bit about how and what we try to do there. In this next slide here, hopefully you'll be able to see the text, just to give you a little sense of what I'm going to try to run through. I'm going to talk a little bit about CASIS very briefly and the work that we do. Then we're going to spend some time talking about learning theory, and then how we really try to integrate the development of skills and knowledge and capacity as farmers simultaneous with the idea of really agents of change, activists, and people who are going to improve the food system for everybody in all of our communities. We'll talk a little bit about some tools that are kind of universal, and that'll be the bulk of the presentation. We'll kind of flow through tools that are universal to more or less all audiences, and then a few things that are maybe specific to some audiences that you may be working with. And we're going to talk about various teaching modalities, how that comes to play. And then the next line here, theory, practice, and praxis. Ultimately, I would say theory is informed by practice, and practice is informed by theory, and that they really meet and play out in the form of this idea of praxis. We will talk a little bit about some challenges and how we try to look at challenges as opportunities, things that, daily experience, daily issues that come up, and how we think about them and what we can try to do with them. And then as you heard, there'll be some time for questions and queries at the end. And I'm also going to share a resource page that everyone will get to see of various articles and information you may want to check out. So the Center for Agroecology and Sustainable Food Systems, we really do many different things here. We have a 50-plus year history, and we focus on hands-on training that is informed by scientific practices. We also do on-farm research, agronomic research on a variety of topics and subject areas. In particular, right now, one of the principal threads that's happening is looking at the impact of methyl bromide on the environment, which is strawberries are a major crop in our area, and then alternatives to methyl bromide, both the human impacts and community impacts as well as environmental impacts, and what are some biological processes that might serve the same purpose to support both conventional and organic strawberries. We do some work in social systems research, and then also historically have done a lot with biological control as well, pest control, though that's sort of at a low ebb right now. But that's a little bit about CASIS, and I encourage you, if you want to learn more, to look at our website, and there's all sorts of information about all of our different programs, research publications, and so forth, and most all of which are readily accessible as downloadable PDFs. So let's move into the world of adult and what's sometimes referred to as transformational learning theory. We use the term transformational learning theory because ultimately we are trying to grow skills and capacity and simultaneously grow and evolve identity, people's sense of purpose, sense of who they are and what they can do in the world, and that's a lot of times where the transformational aspect comes up. In parentheses here are some, those are all references to some authors and writers who are in the resource page at the end, but I'm just going to run through a few of the kind of core concepts that come up in adult and transformational learning theory. First of all, an early researcher, Kolb, speaks a lot about the idea of learners building knowledge by creating meaning from experience, where they go through a process, they reflect upon that process, and then ultimately come away with new understanding and a new meaning that really is purposeful and relevant for them, for the learner. There's another very important theory that's sometimes referred to as situated learning theory, and that's principally brought forth by two people, Lev and Wegner. And again, this is the same idea of knowledge and understanding grows through meaningful experience. And what we mean by meaningful is really real work, not something that is abstracted, not something that's purely, a laboratory experiment for the sake of seeing the outcome, but actual processes that have useful outcomes. And so that's, I think, a very obvious point in the world of farming, because if we're training people about farming and we're actually growing crops and we're growing them from seed to harvest, seed to seed even, there's very, very direct and tangible experiences that can be tied throughout that. And ultimately, there will be consequences if we forget to water, or we have a pest problem that we're not monitoring, we're not maintaining good pest and disease management practices. There'll be consequences that might not be desirable, but might also be good learning outcomes for our audiences. And in the process of all of this, one of the really important ways that adults in particular learn is by having a certain sense of responsibility and ownership in the processes and in the outcomes. And so a big part of how we think about setting things up is there's still management and input and direction from our staff, but ultimately we really want the students, the learners, the apprentices, to take this on as their own. Another important thing that Lev and Wegner talk about is that learning is really a social process. It often happens in a group, or what in the academic world they often refer to as a cohort, people who come in with similar levels of experience or somewhat similar levels of experience, and then they work side by side with their peers, with mentors, and then work on changing and evolving their identity. They develop identity within that cohort, but then also identity as change agents as well. Another arena that we think about and try to blend all of these worlds together too is that learning essentially happens in 3 different domains or sort of areas, arenas. The cognitive is really, brain function things, but it's about content knowledge, and some of that certainly comes through books, some of that comes through seeing and doing. The psychomotor skills, and ultimately that's really about the hands-on experience and hands-on knowledge, cementing and solidifying maybe more abstract concepts. And then finally, the affective domain is really about one's attitudes and feelings about a process, about outcomes, and then the values that are associated. Say, in the case, we're trying to train people about sustainable and organic farming, and then changing and evolving the food system. And there's clearly a bunch of implicit values in all of that hopefully, if we're on a good path, hopefully are things that our audience grows and evolves their own relationship to as well. Another real informative person in this, and kind of relating to the same thing about values and identity, is Paulo Freire, and there's a term there, conscientization. Essentially, as I've written here, is about growing an understanding about social and political forces that structure our world, that create various oppressions and inequities and so forth. And then from that sort of foundational knowledge, then thinking about how we can engage in strategies that create a different food system, in this case speaking about food, but really thinking about, it could be about changing any sort of structure. And then finally, Bell Hooks speaks a lot about the idea of transgression and liberation. And transgression is ultimately just not about accepting the norm of power structures and the way things are is the way they will always be, but rather that if we understand what are the forces that created the way things are, if they're not perfect in serving everyone as they are, then perhaps if we understand how they've come about, we can also seek solutions to creating a more inclusive and representative society and farming and food system. So that's some of the kind of underlying theory that we think about and that informs our work. In the process, we are really interested in 2 simultaneous goals. We're really interested in people building a solid foundation to go out into the world as lifelong learners and practitioners in the food system, people growing high-quality food, but then also simultaneously developing this identity of that their work at whatever level, whether it's how they engage with the farm workers and the apprentices on their farm, to who and how they distribute and deliver the food that they have. But ultimately, people are really thinking, obviously you have to think about the bottom line, and we always kind of try to emphasize this idea of the triple bottom line that you've no doubt heard a lot about, but benefiting the society, benefiting the environment, and ultimately benefiting the farm. So that's kind of a key kind of process. And sometimes it may seem like these two things are a little bit at odds with one another. In simply from, we work in a 6-month time frame, of 6-month intensive program, and we're trying to fill many different curricular arenas at the same time. And so one of the key things is this idea of integration, that the skills and knowledge around farming are intimately linked to skills and knowledge around food system change and building equity and access. And so this is something, as we go through these slides, you'll see that comes up again and again in our processes. I want to maybe mention a couple things that are, I think they're both in certain instances general to all audiences, anybody you might be working with, and in some other instances perhaps to some just a smaller subset of who the audiences are that you might be working with. But in our process of really trying to contextualize agriculture and farming in the larger society in which we all live in and exist, we actually spend a fair amount of time, especially in the early outset as we're building the group and building cohesion amongst the group of people who come to our program. We spend a fair amount of time looking at anti-oppression training, basic communication skills, listening skills, things of that nature, that give people more capacity to really engage with their fellow students, and then hopefully are skills that are transferable out into the world that they'll be able to use in all of their future engagements. And in this, we're also trying to, many different movements, whether it's environmental, social movements for economic change, whatever, often are really separated out and operating independently. So part of the conversation that we try to foster is kind of the links and interconnections across these different movements. And one of the ways that our staff, I think, is really able to draw in as many participants as possible and really feel like the content and experience is relevant and meaningful for their lives is to really look at multiple sources of knowledge. That not all of the farming traditions in the world evolved out of a European perspective, so certainly plenty of good information has come from there, and plenty of the European practices have been a synchronization, a blending of practices from around the world, and ultimately we really want to value the breadth of skills and knowledge, and put that out for people to see and to realize that there are many different pathways, many different avenues that will get you to a good quality end result, good care for the soil and the land and the community. Very often I would say that the best strategies there are certainly plenty of universal principles, but the application of those strategies always really needs to be place-based and community-based. And so that's something that we always try to get our audience to reflect upon. And I mentioned this idea that discussion and reflection on what are the sources of inequity in the food system, and then how you as an individual or you as a community might really be able to be an agent of change. And labor is certainly a very clear one, and I think that everybody who comes through our program, whether they're going to be working in an urban farm setting, in a more rural setting, how the work gets done, who is doing the work, how we are fed, how our farm system is run and kept moving efficiently. So much of that is tied to the labor and the workforce that you have to engage with, and then how you engage and support people to make your operation run smoothly. So this is all kind of context for us and sort of underpinnings of the core agricultural skills. I mentioned a little bit about this idea of trying to keep that relevance, that things have to really be accessible. The content knowledge has to be accessible. The information needs to connect to people's real world experience and be relevant for their future. And this happens in a lot of ways that we help work down this road. Is first of all is really trying to build strong relationships and trust between our participants and the staff, and some of that really comes through that early work on communications workshops and anti-oppression training and so forth. But it comes in many different forms, and ultimately it's about close human connection. The presenters and practitioners, the experts that we show, that we use above and beyond our own in-house staff, and we have kind of a smaller in-house staff of 6 or so primary farmers / instructors, and then we also bring in all sorts of outside speakers from our region, and so we really try to make sure that the people who are our experts are people that our audience can identify with, because we have a very diverse constituent base of people who come through our program, and with quite a range of background and life experience. The idea of cultural relevance and inclusion and visibility also really comes up even in just what crops we choose to grow, and the language that we use around them. And, some of that might be, a lot of, so many crops came from the quote unquote new world and are now very common and staple crops in the old world. But we really try to make sure that people understand sources. Where did these plants come from? How do they move around the world? Why were they renamed? What were their original, the names from the cultures that they came from? All of these things, I think, build a broader knowledge base and a more of a historical context for people. And then for people who come from more marginalized communities, also really, I think, help people feel better connected and that their histories are present and part of the picture that we're really sharing. So that's something we're always going back to. And then finally, just a couple of other things I'll mention. Our program costs participants a fair amount of money to get here or to participate in the program. We charge like $6,000 for a 6-month experience, and that's a lot of money for many folks, and especially going into an arena that isn't always the most profitable of arenas. And so we have worked really hard to provide a very healthy, robust scholarship pool, so that our program is not, the financial aspect of the program doesn't create any barriers that would prevent people from getting here. And that's working through private foundations, individual donors. Sometimes, we previously had a BFRDP grant, a training grant, and written into that was a significant amount of scholarship money for the 3+ years that we had the grant. And that was really, really useful in creating pathways and access to our program. And then even once people get there, we have somebody on staff whose primary job is to really make sure that everybody in the community is feeling supported and is feeling as though this experience is important and relevant for them. And that's just kind of the ongoing resources and support that people might need to really feel, to come and be engaged and stay engaged and really thrive in the educational context that you're creating. The last thing that's on this page is not something that we deal with very much in our environment, but may well be the case for a lot of people. Our program, there's a lot of Spanish speakers in California, and many of our staff speak Spanish, but our whole program is taught in English, but that isn't always the case for everybody, and then using things like visual tools, having good translation services where maybe more technical knowledge is critical. That's also really, really important. And I've seen a lot of great examples of where more graphic information, more drawings and such are used rather than a lecture type format when language was a barrier. So thinking of how can you play that out if that's something relevant for your audience. I want to return to one of the kind of core ideas in some of the adult education theory, and this is this idea of what's referred to as zones of proximal development. And essentially what this is about is that your learner audience can see themselves and see sort of the future and next steps, sort of next cognitive levels, next skill levels, and so forth in their teachers and mentors. And if you look here, you'll see I've written in the textbook, the site managers. That's our perennial staff. That's the folks who've been here for many years, have pretty extensive and in-depth knowledge. We also have assistant managers, and they also bring a tremendous amount of knowledge and experience. We then have what we sometimes call second year or advanced apprentices, and those were people who just went through our 6-month intensive program and then applied and were selected and stay on to be present for a full additional year. And so they are really a key connection with our first year apprentices. The first year apprentices come for the 6-month experience, and the people who are our second year apprentices were just in their shoes. So they're a really obvious sort of milestone or marker for what might be next for them. And then the same is really true. We have student staff who work with us, undergraduates who work with us, and they're sort of a step ahead, have more experience and knowledge base in most cases than the interns. And then we host a lot of undergraduate classes as well. And the classes usually are here for shorter periods of time. And the interns are sort of maybe a step ahead of them. So it's what I would call an experience continuum. Is kind of a range of experience. And it's really valuable, really important for people to sort of see what's next. Where am I going to? If I stay focused and I stay on this path, who are sort of role models and mentors that what's my next step in the pathway? And so this is something that we are very fortunate in the range of audiences that we deal with, that we kind of have quite a continuum for people to work through. Getting into kind of what I'll just call modes of instruction, we sometimes joke that this is our primary mantra, the I do, we do, you do. For much of what we do here, we start a lot of our subject matter starts with some sort of classroom-based experience, but not always, and then typically moves on to a demonstration where there's some sort of three-dimensional practice that we really try to show technique and process and discuss what's going on there. And then we move into side-by-side and what's sometimes referred to as scaffolded activity, wherein the participants are doing the work, but the staff and the assistant staff are right there side-by-side with them, giving them input and feedback, but also taking a step back so that it's really their work that's happening. And then finally, and this is where ownership and responsibility really come in, is for folks to continue on and repeat and do more of that same activity, but basically independently. Perhaps you're still in the background, you're still watching, you're going to provide feedback and input as needed, but ultimately you step back far enough that people really take it on as their own, and they can really invest their thought and integrity and energy into the processes and the outcomes. Ultimately, hopefully mastering the particular skill or task at hand. The next couple of slides, we're going to really just talk about something that we do again and again. I mentioned this idea of demonstrations already, but we spend a lot of time demonstrating techniques out in the field, in the orchards. We also spend a tremendous amount of time going out and looking at the crops and assessing crop health, talking about the impacts of spacing, crop density and spacing and weed management, irrigation strategies, etc. Really trying to use the living landscape, the rich tapestry, the contextually rich space that we have to engage people through multiple learning modalities, to engage their fingertips, to engage their visual stimulation, such as smell and touch, really all of those things simultaneously, so that they work through all of these different modalities. And if you read anything about learning theory, you see that some people learn in one particular fashion, one learn in another fashion. Some people are more kinetic, some are learn through hearing and reading, et cetera, et cetera. And what we found is to really reach as many people as possible and touch on, it really requires touching on as many different levels and using multiple modalities side by side or sequentially, so that people really invest all of their senses in the process. So on the idea of demonstrations, we use demonstrations on a regular basis, very detailed discussion and physical demonstration of practices and processes. But then also, we try to really think about demonstrations as a means of showing how what we're doing with this one crop is transferable and applicable to another crop. So in this case, like in the upper right corner there, Liz is harvesting lettuce, and she's, this is for a young baby lettuce and specific to that crop. But the skills that are required is in terms of mechanical skills and physical efficiencies and so forth. Those are broadly transferable. Assessing to other similar crops, assessing maturity, thinking about your pack-out standards, your washing, all of that, even if it's lettuce or a particular flower crop or whatever, we're always trying to expand that out, and so people see that this skill set is not isolated to one thing, but is applicable to many different things, and ultimately so that they are building skill capacity, working towards increased knowledge and capacity. Same basic theme here. The two different lessons here are two different things around soil science, and on the left we have a group of undergraduate students who are talking about impacts of cultivation, and then soil structure, soil aggregates, soil tilth. And to really see that, you got to be right in there in the midst of it. So people have got to get their hands good and dirty. And similarly, the exercise on the right is all about soil texture and structure. And here we're digging a soil pit profile so people can see about different horizons and evolution and development of soil. And everybody's going to get down and in that. The instructor in the center there is Ed, but everybody else is going to get down and in the midst of that too, because that's really key, that people get a good firsthand look on everything. Another thing I guess I would just say in this idea of hands-on exercises, that's sort of a follow-up to the field walks, is we're looking at, there's one here, the irrigation distribution uniformity test. The other in the top right is looking at different seed plates to seed out a particular crop. And in each of these cases, there's the specific question of, okay, what's impacting? Do we have good uniform irrigation distribution, and what's impacting it? But then building out and beyond that to sort of the whole farm system, what are the impacts of a lack of irrigation uniformity? If we don't have good irrigation uniformity, does that mean that we're going to have pest or disease issues? Are we going to have different maturation rates, different crop quality rates? Is that going to impact your marketing outcomes? Nothing, hopefully little to nothing that we do is taken in isolation, but it rather is all part of a bigger picture. So more, field walks is, same basic. We do, so far it looks like we're almost entirely outdoors, and we spend most of our time outdoors, probably 75 to 80% of our time outdoors, but we do spend some time in the classroom for sure. And there, those may be more traditional sort of didactic lecture style presentations, not unlike this morning, or they may be much more interactive depending on the subject matter and who the instructor is and so forth. Similarly, we take a lot of field trips. We go to many other farms. In this case, it's an equipment auction yard in that top picture. But we want people to see and learn in kind of the strengths of our system, but also to see other systems and other processes, how other people are achieving sort of the same goals based on the constraints and opportunities that they have, so that people have a broader set of information to draw on as they try to set up their own farm systems or come in to manage somebody else's farm system coming down the road as well. This is actually, so we even when we're in the classroom, this is an illustration on the chalkboard in one of our garden classrooms. But what you can't see in this slide is all of these different root forms. This was a class on root systems, really just about root system processes. And this particular class, it was called Root Systems Revealed, and in a table in the middle of the room around everybody is plants that we've dug up and washed off the roots and so forth that represent all these different things. And then so we spent a lot of time both looking at the structure of roots, but more importantly, perhaps, how does that play out for us in terms of ways that we might think about propagating or growing the plants and what kind of conditions they might need, as well as what are the roles, what are the things that roots actually provide, and how do they provide those things for plants. So 3 dimensions in the classroom as much as possible, I think, really keeps things more alive and keeps people far more engaged. At the outset, I talked a lot about this idea of direct and applied experience. In this instance here, we have a hoop house that had cover crop. It's being cleared. We're going to sell and eat the pea tops there, or the fava tops. And then ultimately we grew carrots and to maturity in that crop. And the same students were involved in the whole process from start to finish. One thing that comes up for us sometimes, and this perhaps could fall into the challenges and opportunities realm, is that people sometimes feel like, okay, I've done this once or twice, I've got this, I'm pretty much an expert now. And we often feel like, well, actually, you really need to do this over and over and over again. And the more you do something, you certainly develop muscle memory, you develop coordination and efficiency, things become perhaps a little bit more intuitive. But it's just like any, if you take an example of reading, kids learn to read in the first, second grade or so, and they might say, oh yeah, now I know how to read. But ultimately they've learned the basics of how to read, but have they learned, vocabulary? Do they understand the grammar? Do they have precision in their reading? Can they understand and interpret the content? The same is really true of all these physical tasks. Repetition really builds depth of knowledge. So that's something that we certainly focus on. I've mentioned this idea of opportunity and ownership, and we do this through a variety of ways, but probably the 3 most important ways are that we put our students with support and content knowledge and so forth, but we put our students in charge of all of the crop irrigation on the farm. We also put them in charge of seed sowing and greenhouse management, again with plenty of support and supervision. we step back as skills in the development. And then they are also, they become harvest coordinators, and they coordinate the whole crew. They do the crop forecasting, and then they take our crops to market. We do a roadside stand at the base of campus. We also have a CSA and do some direct marketing to our campus as well. Ultimately, trying to really put people in that full responsibility mode so that their skills increases and is ever stronger. And then let's see. So there's a thinking just about strategies. We also, though, it takes away perhaps from some of our production time. We do a lot of work, or a fair amount at least, with kind of observation exercises and ask people to reflect on things, problem-solving exercises. If you encounter this, what would you do? Where are the resources? And sometimes this is by sending people out to look at things. Sometimes it's through journal prompts. As an example of trying to help people think about synthesizing knowledge and how they're going to transfer knowledge that they've gained and built, how they transfer that to the farm community or the place they'll be going back to. If you know what that is. We might then ask the question such as, identify a production or a distribution and access problem that you previously before coming to our program. And then since you've arrived here, what new tools, knowledge, and processes do you now have that can help you address this situation? And perhaps most importantly as well, what's still lacking? What do you still need to learn to address the situation that you're thinking of? Because one of the things we want to make sure, we don't do a lot of testing and so forth, but we simultaneously are asking people to always reflect on their learning goals and compare those to what we have as curricular goals, and are they making progress? Are they in fact building the capacities that they've come here to build on? I mentioned this idea of we're always trying to make things not isolate. You may have important isolated information, but also simultaneously make sure things are broadly applicable and that can transfer beyond that particular crop. One of the ways we do that is idea like management templates. How do we think about pest or disease issues, for example? What are the different monitoring strategies? What are the different preventative and intervention strategies we might use on one crop? And then how does that apply to other crops? And then how would you adapt those processes to your location in the future? And really back to learning theory, as people witness results and witness successes and so forth, that gives help, and then allows them to really refine their future actions and refine future decision-making processes. If outcomes weren't optimal, usually the refinement is great. If outcomes were good or really strong, and maybe the refinement is more subtle, but still part of the process of continual improvement. I'll just maybe run through a couple key things here. Additional strategies, we always try to bring humor and food and light into the picture. People love to eat. They love to share kind of cultural backgrounds around food. Always visual, tactile stimulus throughout, using stories and your own personal relationship and the history of particular crops has been really, really valuable for us. We often, so students ask us questions, and we often respond to their questions with a question, essentially asking them to answer the question themselves, or think about how are they going to go find the resources to answer the question, because they won't be with us at all times and won't necessarily be able to draw upon our staff for question answers. And then we also use this idea of it depends, because there may be times when the question, is, oh, what's the temperature at which thermodormancy is triggered in lettuce? And, that might be a very straightforward answer. Oh, that's about 80 to 82 degrees Fahrenheit. But ultimately, that's an important piece of information. But I always want people to think a little bit more broadly about the context. What are the decision-making factors? What are the causal influences besides temperature? What are the whole suite of things that might lead to thermodormancy? And what would you do differently? Or if it's something damping off, well, there's a set of environmental conditions that really promote fungal pathogens off organisms in greenhouses. So how do we get people to think about that whole picture? Sometimes rather than just maybe a narrow question. And I was asking open-ended questions for folks. I mentioned the idea of peer-to-peer learning before, especially if you're dealing with more advanced audiences. Farmer-to-farmer information exchange is always useful, and that's really just a continuum of the peer-to-peer learning exercises. And certainly our audience who are really just beginning farmers, always look up to really appreciate the knowledge and experience that gain from the farmers that get to visit their field trips, and then those future and perhaps long-term connections and resources for them as well. There's one of my colleagues, Jake, who's done a whole separate on student feedback, but that's a really important part of it, is trying to understand how effective is the work that you're doing. Are we succeeding the way that we think that we're succeeding? And if not, what do we need to do to refine our practices? So just a few things, we engage with all kinds of different people with a range of backgrounds, and so you might ask yourself, well, how do we deal with audiences with different levels of experience? Well, we try to have the people with more experience be mentors for the people with less experience. Oftentimes it maybe means teaching somewhat towards the middle, and then asking the people with more experience to go deeper and give them the tools they need to go deeper, but also not leaving behind the people with less experience. And whenever we're having conversation and discussion, it's very typical in a larger group or even a mid-sized group that you maybe have just a couple of voices who take up a lot of the airspace, ask a lot of questions and so forth. And it's always on our end an effort to try to make sure that everybody is heard and everybody's questions, everybody has an opportunity to ask their questions. And sometimes that means telling the louder voices, okay, well, let's talk about that after class, or that's a little bit off topic, so we'll come back to that. And we deal with every day with people working at different paces, different speed, and we just really try to encourage everybody to work to their full capacity without breaking their backs or anything. And then working side by side with people and role modeling speed and efficiency, but also caring for your body and yourself simultaneously. Probably one of the biggest challenges that we face is what we've got here towards near the bottom, transition from talking to doing. There's often a little bit of an awkward time or moment from okay, we talked about it, so now let's get into it, let's do it. And a lot of times that takes, having maybe whoever was the primary talker, having some support staff who's ready to go, who's got the tools, who can step right into action on the doing the task part of things. And in a way, they're sort of they're chaperones or cheerleaders, but really they're just role modeling good work and good, smooth, fluid transition. And then always trying to be prepared. We're always trying to assess how long does it take to do a particular project, and then making sure that we're prepared and ready to transition people right into the next thing, again, so that our time's used effectively and efficiently. And in the end, our ultimate goal here is really we're faced with this challenge of trying to balance production and education. This is very much a production farm, and we sell up $150,000 or more dollars worth of produce a year, and that's a significant contribution to our overall budget. But our primary crop, really the most important thing that we're growing, is a new generation of farmers and gardeners and educators and activists who are going to go back out into the world and share their knowledge and experience. They're going to grow nutritious food for market and for community. And so for us, striking a balance of production and education is always important. It's an ongoing quest and query, but the education part is really at the heart of what we do. And I think that's an important question to ask yourself can I place the educational effort? Because make no mistake, it takes a lot of time and energy to really center the educational effort. Or is it going to be something that is an important part of what we do, but perhaps not central? The production is the central part, and we layer in various elements of the educational element. And both are fine. It's just important to be clear about where you're going and what you're trying to do. So I think at this point, maybe if you folks have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. Otherwise, I can also touch on a little bit of some of the resources that are in the next slide. But yeah, if anybody in the audience has any questions, anything I've talked about, don't hesitate to ask.
Thanks so much, Christof. This is Kristen again. Just a reminder, if you do have any questions, feel free to send them through the chat box, and that can be addressed to all participants or just to the presenter, whatever your preference. I don't see any questions coming through at the moment, Christof. We can maybe wait another moment here to see if any come in.
Okay. Yeah, and maybe if that's, I'll just back up a little bit to maybe some of the challenges and opportunities, and we can talk a little bit about more of these things, because I think these are fairly universal that people are going to find in almost any situation. And, I was even sort of thinking about like this slide here where we're out in a field. One of our instructors, our former instructor here, is talking again about harvest processes. And if you look at this, some people seem like they're paying attention, some are taking notes, some are looking off in the woods, some are weeding. I actually always feel like if people are weeding and listening simultaneously, that's a great sort of multitasking approach. But, anytime we're out there, we have to kind of keep people moving and keep all of their senses engaged. And it certainly, if you get too bogged down or too deep in any one topic, sometimes you lose people's attention. And movement's a good way to kind of capture people's attention back in, and or to ask people to really ask people, okay, so what are you seeing in this crop? Does this crop look like it's healthy and mature and ready for harvest? Do you see signs of pest or disease? Do you see fertility issues that might be going on here? Because if you do that kind of stuff, you're hopefully able to then really draw people into whatever is right in front of you, so that they actually so that they are more engaged, paying better attention. One of the things, a thing that comes up, I think more in the classroom setting, but it also comes up in the in-field setting as well, is people asking questions that maybe aren't really germane to the task or the subject at hand. That's kind of for myself personally, I find that sort of an in-the-moment thing in trying to think about, do I answer this because I can do this quickly and easily now, or is it a bigger, broader discussion, and that's going to really kind of derail where we're going at this moment in time? And if that's the case, then I'll try to say, okay, well, can we talk about that at lunch, or can we talk about that at a later time? Excuse me. If it's something that can be addressed in the short term and isn't going to derail us, then really try to be responsive to people's questions in the here and now is really, I think, is critical and useful.
Great.
Yeah.
Christof, actually, we got a question that came through that's, I guess, related to challenges. Someone asked, do you ever have to ask a student to leave your curriculum?
To leave the entire program? That's such a great question. In the 20-plus years that I have been here, so we have 39 students every year, plus our second-year apprentices, and I've been here in a couple of different capacities, but since 1994, and I think we've had to ask there was 2 people who chose to leave who we were on the verge of having to ask leave because of a variety of kind of, social transgressions and aggressive behavior and so forth. That's a really difficult position to be in. I can say that basically we've had very limited opportunity or challenge that was that severe, and we're always going to try to work with people and try to get them more engaged and find out, okay, are there things that, what could be different that would help you be more engaged or fit better with the group and so forth. But you do have to ask at a certain point, how much time and energy can you invest in this one person, and is that then distracting from the time and energy that you're investing in the rest of the group? And that's sort of, I think, the calculus for us is we always want to bring people along and keep them engaged and part of our program. But if it's going to take so much energy and really distract from the rest of the group, that's where like the 2 people that I referenced, we were basically about to ask 2 different people quite a few years ago on over a couple different year period. And fortunately for us, we never actually had to ask them to leave, but we were ready to do so. Yeah, that's a tough one for sure. And you have your production system that's being impacted. You have the social dynamics of the whole group. You have people's ability to learn and really engage if they're being distracted by a bunch of social upheaval and so forth. That can really limit people's ability to build their skills and capacity as farmers. So I would definitely say if you can provide good support and try to keep people in, that's key. But ultimately, you'll do more good for the rest of the group if you do ask people to leave that are just not working out. Yeah. So let me just go. I'm going to go to a very quick little promo here. These are 2 different covers of 2 different training manuals that we have on our website. They're both entirely downloadable as PDFs, either individual units or as the whole text. You just need a printer and a lot of paper if you wanted to, and a lot of ink if you want to print them. The one on the left is like 700 pages long, and it is essentially designed with a whole bunch of skills and practices around farming in a lecture format with content-rich lectures that instructors can use. And in fact, many other programs around the country have taken aspects of this and then changed and adapted it to fit their programs and their contexts. But I encourage folks who are thinking about developing and expanding their curriculum to look at the manual online in particular. We've also got more recently published a bunch of grower guides that were from a California Department of Food and Ag grant that look at a variety of contents and practices and agronomic information. So this is way too much to go through really quickly, but I just wanted to point this page out to folks. All of the different people that I mentioned in terms of learning theory and transformational education, they're all listed here. And then there are some other, like the article on the top right by Jim Leap, who's a former instructor here, and then went on as a beginning farmer mentor, mentoring younger farmers, beginning farmers around the area. There's a bunch of reflection on his experience and best practices. There's also just recently came out, and I don't know if I have this on here. There's There's a whole series of best practices and evaluation methods and so forth that was through the Beginning Farmer and Rancher Development Program. I don't know if that's actually on here. Now that I look at this, I can probably send a list to Kristen, who she can send out to everybody. But that's what we must do.
Yeah, I'd be happy to add any additional resources that you think would be helpful.
Yeah, this is kind of there's some fairly straightforward reading and then some somewhat thicker reading here, denser reading. But there's a lot of good information here if folks want to spend kind of really getting a little more in-depth in how curriculum is developed and also how adults and individual adults and adults as a group or cohort really learn and develop their skill set. Yeah. So that just to maybe come to a close here. This is where we work. This is where we learn and try to engage folks on a daily basis. Relatively recent image, although there's some new hoop houses that are not in this picture, but and we're in a it's kind of on the edge between more rural and open landscape and a more densely populated urban landscape, right here on the UCSC campus. So thank you very much, everyone. I know that was a lot to run through. Hopefully you got some useful information and that the PowerPoint PDF version that Kristen's going to send out, that'll be a useful reference for you. And if you have questions in the future, don't hesitate to reach out.
Wonderful. Well, yeah, thank you so much, Christof. This has been a really excellent presentation. Definitely a lot of information, but as has been mentioned, we'll be following up with further resources for you all to dive into. And feel free to reach out with questions anytime. And thanks again. We will be informing you of any future webinars coming up. We'll be conducting a BFRDP application process webinar in mid-December, so be on the lookout for that. And thank you again so very much to Christof Bernau.
You're welcome. It was my pleasure for sure.
Great. Thanks, and have a great afternoon, everyone.